The air in the house was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and sympathy, a smell I knew would be forever seared into my memory as the fragrance of loss. Richard, my husband of 42 years, the steady rhythm of my life, was gone. The funeral was a surreal blur of black suits, hushed condolences, and the hollow, persistent ache in my chest that had become a permanent part of my anatomy. Through it all, our son, David, and his wife, Melanie, had been my anchors. Their hands were a constant, seemingly supportive pressure on my shoulders, their voices a murmur of comfort against the tide of grief. "We're here for you, Mom." "Whatever you need," David had said, his eyes, so unnervingly like his father's, filled with a sorrow that I believed mirrored my own. I had clung to that belief like a drowning woman to a raft. To believe otherwise was to accept a world so fundamentally broken, so devoid of loyalty, that I couldn't bear to contemplate it. Not then, not on the day I buried my husband. On that day, I needed to believe in the goodness of my own child, the last remaining piece of my husband in the world. The day after the funeral, the silence descended. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, somehow louder and more intrusive than the sympathetic murmurs of the crowd had been. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep Richard would never take again. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall measured out the seconds of a future I would now face alone. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the floral pattern of the porcelain mug a blur through my unshed tears, staring into a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The doorbell chimed, a cheerful, jarring sound in the cathedral of my grief. I opened it to find David and Melanie on the doorstep. They came bearing a box of pastries from the good bakery, the one with the almond croissants Richard had loved, and a stack of thick manila folders. The combination of comfort and business was bizarre, but in my fog, I accepted it without question. "We didn't want you to be alone," Melanie said, her smile a little too bright, a little too sharp at the edges. She placed the box of croissants on the counter, a jarring splash of normalcy in the landscape of my grief. "And we figured we could help you get a head start on some of the paperwork. Dad would have wanted us to make sure you were taking care of paperwork." The word landed with a thud in the fog of my mind. It was an obscenity. Richard had always handled the finances. He would balance the checkbook at the kitchen table every Sunday morning, a ritual as comforting and predictable as the sunrise. He'd created a fortress of security for us, and I had never once had to worry about the ramparts. Now, with the king of the castle gone, the barbarians were at the gate, and they came disguised as my own flesh and blood. I was drowning in a sea of grief, unable to think, to process, to do anything but feel the crushing weight of Richard's absence. The thought of navigating the cold, impersonal world of bureaucracy, of death certificates and legal forms was more than I could bear. Their offer, in that moment, felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I don't even know where to begin." "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom," David said, pulling a chair up to the table. He opened one of the folders, revealing a sheaf of papers filled with dense, legalistic text. "These are just some standard formalities. Transfer of assets, things like that. We had our lawyer draw them up to make it easier for you. Just need your signature here and here." He pointed to several yellow tabs sticking out from the pages. I stared at the documents, but the words swam before my eyes. A meaningless jumble of legalese. Transfer of title. Durable power of attorney. The phrases meant nothing to me. All I could see was my son's earnest face, the face I had loved and trusted his entire life. He was Richard's boy, the child we had raised in this very house, the repository of all our hopes and dreams. Of course, I trusted him. To do otherwise would have felt like a betrayal of Richard, of everything we had built. I could almost hear his voice, a gentle chiding from the great beyond. "He's a good boy, Eliza. Just let him help." So I did. I picked up the heavy, expensive-feeling pen they provided and scrawled my name, my familiar signature suddenly looking like a forgery. With each stroke, I felt a strange combination of dread and relief. I was handing over the keys to the kingdom, but at least I wouldn't have to bear the weight of the crown. "Thank you," I whispered again, pushing the papers back towards David. "You're a good son." He smiled, a tight, fleeting expression. "We just want to take care of you, Mom." "Are you sure?" I asked, a flicker of something, a tiny buried instinct, trying to warn me. Melanie placed a cool hand on my arm. "Of course, Eliza. It's just to get everything into your name, to avoid probate and all that legal mess. It's what Richard would have wanted, to protect you, to protect me." The words echoed in my head. Richard had always protected me. It felt right that his son would continue that legacy. So I picked up the pen. My hand trembled as I signed my name on each yellow-flagged line. With each stroke, I felt a small sense of relief, a feeling of unburdening. I was handing over the practicalities to my capable son, so I could focus on the impossible task of learning to live without the love of my life. They left soon after, taking the signed papers with them. "We'll file these for you, Mom," David said, kissing my cheek. "You just rest." I did. For 3 days, I drifted through the house in a daze, wrapped in Richard's old cardigan, the faint scent of his aftershave a ghostly comfort. The casseroles and cards from friends and neighbours piled up, monuments to a life that was now a memory. Then the letter arrived. It was in a long, official-looking envelope addressed to current resident. I opened it with numb fingers. The words were stark, brutal. Notice of eviction. I had 30 days to vacate the premises. My home. The home Richard and I had bought as newlyweds. The home where we had raised our son. The home where every corner held a memory. I sank to the floor, the letter fluttering from my hand. It didn't make sense. This had to be a mistake, a cruel bureaucratic error. I called David, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. He didn't answer. I called again, and again. Voicemail. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the fog of my grief. I called the bank, intending to see if the mortgage payment had cleared. The automated voice on the other end was cheerful, impersonal. "Your checking account balance is $312.41. Your savings account balance is $150 impossible." Richard and I had been careful savers our whole lives. There should have been over $200,000. Our life savings, the nest egg Richard had so proudly built for our retirement. For my future. I finally got through to a human, a patient woman who listened to my frantic, disjointed story. Her voice was gentle when she delivered the final blow. "Ma'am, it looks like the accounts were closed 3 days ago. The funds were transferred out. The transfer was authorized by your son, David, who was recently granted power of attorney, power of attorney. The papers, the yellow tabs, the casual, reassuring smiles. It all crashed down on me. A tidal wave of betrayal so immense, so monstrous, it stole the air from my lungs. The documents I had signed weren't to protect me. They were the weapons used to destroy me. I hadn't just lost my husband. I had lost my son, and I had lost everything we had ever built together. Leaving the house was an agony that dwarfed every other pain I had ever known. It was a physical tearing away, a second death, an amputation of the soul. My home wasn't just a place, it was an extension of my own body, of my own memory. The scent of Richard's pipe tobacco that clung faintly to the curtains in his study, the chipped ceramic mug with the faded picture of the Grand Canyon from our trip in '98, the worn, comfortable dip in the sofa where we'd sat together for 40 years of television and conversation. These weren't just things. They were relics. They were us. This wasn't just wood and plaster. It was the container of my life, the silent witness to 42 years of love, laughter, and tears. Every object I touched screamed with memories. The rocking chair in the corner, where I had spent countless nights nursing a tiny, trusting David. The faded pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, a ladder of his childhood growth. The worn patch of carpet in the living room, an indentation left by Richard's armchair, a ghost of his presence. Packing each box felt like packing away a piece of my own soul, sealing it in cardboard and tape. I became a zombie, a ghost in the ruins of my own life. I moved through the motions of packing, my mind a maelstrom of grief and a white-hot rage so profound it felt like it would burn me up from the inside out. How could they? The question was a constant, agonizing refrain. David and Melanie became ghosts of a different kind. They evaporated. My calls, each one more frantic than the last, went to voicemail. My texts, ranging from confused pleading to raw fury, were met with a digital silence that was more damning than any response. They had simply vanished, leaving a trail of legal and emotional devastation in their wake. My younger sister Carol arrived like a cavalry charge. She took one look at my face, at the boxes, at the eviction notice on the table, and her expression hardened into a mask of fury. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped her arms around me and let me sob, the raw animal sounds of a heart breaking for the second time in as many weeks. She moved me into her small guest room, a space decorated with cheerful pastels and floral prints that felt like a mockery of the black hole that had opened up inside me. It was a cozy, comfortable prison. The first night I lay awake, staring at the unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling, my body aching with a grief so profound it felt physical. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face, his expression of feigned concern, his hand guiding mine as I signed away my life. The betrayal was a sharper, more immediate pain than the grief. The grief was a vast, deep ocean of loss, a natural disaster I was powerless against. The betrayal, however, was a man-made catastrophe, a deliberate act of violence. It was a hot, sharp knife twisting in my gut, and the hand on the handle was my own son's. I would sit in that small, unfamiliar room for hours, staring at the floral wallpaper until the patterns swam before my eyes. The dual traumas of my loss and my son's betrayal were a two-headed serpent, striking at me in an endless, torturous loop. My mind would unspool memories of David as a little boy. The scraped knee from his first bike ride, the triumphant grin when he finally learned to tie his shoes, the fierce way he'd hugged me on his first day of school. How did that sweet boy become this monster? How could he look me in the eye, my face swollen with grief for his own father, and coldly, methodically strip me of everything I had left in the world? The question was a poison, with no antidote. Carol was my rock. She didn't coddle me or offer platitudes. She got angry for me. That boy, she'd mutter, pacing the small living room. I never trusted that wife of his. A shark in kitten heels. She brought me tea I didn't drink and food I didn't eat, but she sat with me in the suffocating silence, a fierce, protective presence that kept me from completely disintegrating. "We're not going to let them get away with this, Eliza," she said one evening, her voice firm. "You are not going to let them win." I just shook my head, the fight completely gone out of me. "What can I do, Carol?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash. I signed the papers. I handed it all to them on a silver platter. I have nothing. Carol knelt in front of me, taking my limp hands in hers. You have your name, you have your dignity, and you have the truth. That's not nothing, Eliza. That's where we start. You have me, she said, her eyes blazing, and you have your mind. We just need a plan. It was a few days later, while sorting through the few boxes of personal items I had managed to salvage, that we found it. Tucked into the back of Richard's old desk, a box of his things I couldn't bear to leave behind, was a small leather-bound address book. And inside, on the first page, was a business card. Arthur Vance, attorney at law. Below the name, in Richard's familiar, elegant script, was a note. The only honest lawyer in the state. A good man, I stared at the card, at my husband's handwriting, It felt like a message from beyond the grave, a lifeline, a tiny flickering spark in the suffocating darkness. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but it was there. It was hope. Arthur Vance's office was a sanctuary of old leather, polished wood, and the comforting smell of books. He was a man in his late 60s, with a kind, weathered face and eyes that held both intelligence and compassion. He had been Richard's friend since their college days, a link to a past that felt a million miles away. He poured me a cup of tea and I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and rage. He listened without interruption, his hands steepled on his desk, his expression growing grimmer with each sickening detail. When I finally fell silent, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock, a sound that, for the first time in weeks, felt comforting rather than mocking. "This is elder abuse, Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble of controlled anger. "Financial exploitation of the most despicable kind. And to do it the day after Richard's funeral, it's monstrous." He explained the legal realities. It would be an uphill battle. I had signed the documents. They would claim I was of sound mind, that I had gifted them the assets. We would have to prove fraudulent inducement, that they had deliberately misrepresented the nature of the documents to trick me into signing. It was my word against my son's. "It will be long and it will be ugly," Arthur warned me. "They will try to paint you as confused, incompetent, a grieving widow who doesn't remember what she agreed to." Are you prepared for that? I thought of my home, of Richard, of the life that had been stolen from me. I thought of David's cold, calculating eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and firm, "I am." The legal battle was a slow, soul-crushing grind. It was everything Arthur had predicted, and worse. A war of attrition fought with motions, affidavits, and endless draining paperwork. It consumed the small amount of money I had left, forcing me to rely entirely on Carol's generosity. Through their lawyer, David and Melanie constructed a chillingly plausible narrative. They painted me as an emotionally unstable, grieving widow, incompetent and confused. The quitclaim deed was to simplify my life. The transfer of our life savings was a gift I had insisted upon in a moment of irrational generosity, which they had accepted only to manage it for my own good. The lies were so audacious, so complete, they made me question my own sanity. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, and there were days it came dangerously close to succeeding. There were days when I wanted to give up, to crawl back into the darkness and let them have their victory. But then I would look at Richard's photo on Carol's mantelpiece, and I would hear Carol's voice, fierce and unwavering. "You are not going to let them win." One rainy afternoon, I was searching for an old photo album in the boxes stored in Carol's garage. In the bottom of a box labelled Richard's office, I found something I had forgotten existed. His journals. He had kept them for years, small leather-bound books filled with his thoughts, his frustrations, his dreams. I sought refuge in the garage, the one place that still smelled mostly of Richard. A combination of sawdust, motor oil, and the rich, earthy scent of potting soil. I sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the detritus of a shared life, and pulled a heavy box towards me. Richard's office, my own neat handwriting labelled on the side. My hands trembled as I opened it. I opened the first journal, my fingers tracing his familiar, elegant script. For an hour, I lost myself in the rhythm of his life. Notes about the optimal time to plant tomatoes, frustrations with his golf swing, thoughts on a biography he was reading. It was so achingly, wonderfully him. And then, in a volume from the previous year, tucked between a note about fertilizing the roses and a complaint about a leaky faucet, I found it. "Spoke with David today," he had written, "worried about him. He and Melanie are in some kind of financial trouble again. He hinted about needing a substantial loan. I told him no. Eliza and I worked our whole lives for our security. I will not see it squandered on their reckless spending. Melanie's influence on him is not good. She sees us as a bank, not as family. My hands trembled. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding, and then an entry from just 3 months before his death. Had a difficult conversation with David. He brought up the house again, the inheritance. I made it explicitly clear. The house, the savings, everything is for Eliza. It is her security, her home. It is not to be touched. I made him promise me he would always look after his mother. He promised. I hope he understands the gravity of that promise. It was a voice from the grave. It was Richard, my Richard, still protecting me. I sat there on the floor of that dusty garage and wept. But these were not tears of grief. They were tears of vindication. Arthur's face, when I showed him the journals, was a study in grim satisfaction. "This is it, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet. "This is the smoking gun." The deposition was held in a sterile, soulless conference room, the air thick with unspoken hostility. David and Melanie sat across the long, polished table, their faces smooth, impassive masks of concern. Their lawyer was slick and confident, a shark in a $1,000 suit. I sat next to Arthur, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap, my knuckles were white. Richard's journal was in my briefcase, its weight a solid, reassuring presence. David began to speak, and his voice was a masterpiece of calm, reasonable concern. He wove a tapestry of lies with threads of truth, speaking of my profound grief, my natural confusion, my legendary generosity. He was the portrait of a dutiful son, burdened but loving, trying to do what was best for his poor, widowed mother. It was a performance worthy of a stage. He was playing the role of a lifetime, the grieving, dutiful son, forced to make difficult decisions for his own mother's good. And as I watched him, my heart, already broken, seemed to calcify. The last vestiges of my maternal love, the deep, instinctual bond that had defined so much of my life, withered and died. It was a quiet, internal death, but it was as final as Richard's. The love didn't just die, it was murdered, and I was forced to watch. I felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. The boy I had raised, the child I had adored, was well and truly gone. The creature sitting across from me, with my son's face and my husband's eyes, was a stranger. Then Arthur began his questioning. He led David through his story step by step, and then he slid a photocopy of the journal entry across the table. "Mr. Henderson," Arthur said, his voice like ice, "could you please read your father's words, written 3 months before his death?" David's eyes scanned the page. A flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed his face. So quickly I almost missed it. His lawyer objected, but the judge, who was presiding over the deposition, overruled him. David began to read, his voice faltering. I made it explicitly clear, the house, the savings, everything is for Eliza. I made him promise me he would always look after his mother. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. He looked up, and his eyes met mine. For the first time, the mask slipped. I saw not a monster, but a weak, desperate man, cornered by his own father's integrity. His face crumpled. A single choked sob escaped his lips. It was over. Faced with the journals, their case collapsed. Their lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall, pushed for a settlement. They agreed to sign the house back over to me and to return 80% of the money they had stolen. The other 20% they had already spent. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Arthur advised me to take it. A trial would be long, public, and painful, with no guarantee of a better outcome. I agreed. I didn't want a trial. I just wanted my life back. Months later, I stood in the doorway of my home. The keys felt heavy and real in my hand. It smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish, the scent of a new beginning. Carol and I had spent weeks cleaning it from top to bottom, scrubbing away not just the dust, but the lingering taint of the betrayal. We opened the windows, letting the fresh air chase out the stale memories. It was still the house Richard and I had shared, filled with the echoes of our life together, but it was different now. It was mine, in a way it had never been before. I had fought for it. I had earned it. I never spoke to David or Melanie again. The settlement was handled through our lawyers. The relationship was not just broken, it was annihilated. There was no path back from what they had done. But as the days turned into weeks, I found a strange, unexpected peace. I had survived the unthinkable. I had lost everything, and I had fought my way back. I started gardening again, planting new life in the soil Richard had so lovingly tended. I reconnected with old friends. I volunteered at the local library. I found a strength in myself I never knew I possessed, a resilience forged in the fires of grief and betrayal. One evening, I sat on the back porch, the same porch where Richard and I had shared countless cups of coffee and watched the sun set. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of orange and purple, a spectacle of defiant beauty. I thought of Richard, and a gentle smile touched my lips. The sharp, stabbing pain of his loss had softened into a warm, bittersweet ache. I had not just reclaimed my house, I had reclaimed myself. The woman who had trustingly signed those papers, the naive widow who believed in the inherent goodness of her own child, was gone forever. She had died in that cold conference room, listening to her son's lies. In her place was a woman who understood the world in a way she never had before. A woman who had learned the bitter lesson that love and loyalty are not always unconditional, and that sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted by the hands you once held. I had walked through the darkest valley imaginable and had emerged on the other side, not unscathed but unbroken. The life ahead of me was not the one I had planned with Richard over decades of quiet conversation and shared dreams. The life ahead of me was not the one I had planned, but it was mine to shape. For 42 years, my story had been a we. Now, it was just I. It was a blank page, and while the thought of writing on it alone was terrifying, it was also, in a strange and unexpected way, liberating. I had found the bottom, the absolute bedrock of despair, and I had discovered it was solid enough to push off of. And for the first time in a long, long time, I looked towards the future, not with fear, but with a quiet, steady hope.